If you had to guess what the deadliest lightning strike of all time was, what would you say? Maybe 6 people, maybe 10 people, something like that? Well, you wouldn't be far off. In fact, it's 21, and it happened in what was then Rhodesia back in 1975, when lightning struck a small hut where villagers were sheltering. That's the worst death toll from a direct lightning strike, but if you're talking about deaths caused by a lightning strike, then that's on a whole other level, and it wasn't lightning striking a plane. It happened in Egypt back in 1994, and it's known as the Dronka lightning disaster. Dronka was a nondescript village in Egypt situated about 300 kilometres south of Cairo. It's home to around 20,000 people, most of them farmers. A cluster of low-lying, mostly single-storey dwellings surrounded by farmland, low hills, and a railway line that ran behind the village. In fact, just about the only notable thing in Dronka wasn't in the village itself, but what was located just beyond the perimeter, and that was a massive fuel depot which sat on the slope just above the town. This depot was comprised of 8 massive storage tanks, each one holding around 5,000 tonnes of diesel or aviation fuel. Most villagers didn't ask too many questions about these tanks, as this was a military installation, a strategic reserve run by the Egyptian General Petroleum Company on behalf of the Egyptian Air Force. There had been some concerns raised by some of the more outspoken village members, but nothing had come of these appeals. No one in the military seemed too bothered about the gripes of a few simple villagers. Now, despite the fact that this was a military installation, the tanks weren't hidden away somewhere remote. In fact, the closest houses sat barely 100 metres away from the nearest tanks. In terms of safety considerations, there didn't seem to have been much thought given to any. There was no wall, no trench, no safety perimeter of any kind. The tanks simply sat on raised open ground above the village, with just the railway embankment between the two. The 2nd of November 1994 was a day of intense rain and thunder over much of upper and central Egypt. For 5 hours, torrential rain poured down onto the Asyut province, and over 120 villages reported localised flooding, including Dronka. But then, something terrible happened, something that turned a normal, lousy, wet afternoon into a scene of utter horror. At some point during the storm, a lightning strike hit the storage facility up on the hill above the village. Now, maybe it hit one of the tanks directly, or maybe it hit a structure close enough to arc over to one of the tanks. Nobody knows for sure. But either way, one tank caught fire and then exploded. These tanks were only spaced about 60 metres apart, which might have looked alright on paper, but in reality this was nowhere near enough to space them out. A chain reaction began as another of the tanks caught fire, and vast pools of burning jet fuel mixed with diesel and flood water began to flood down the hill and back up behind the railway embankment. 2 more of the tanks were ruptured when a nearby footbridge, weakened by floodwater, was swept into them. As these thousands of extra tons of fuel spilled into the rising waters, it continued to pool up behind the railway embankment, and that was now acting like a temporary dam. As there was no runoff channel to divert this newly formed lake of fire, it just continued to grow and build up behind the railway embankment, and of course, the railway embankment, not designed to hold back a flood, did exactly what you'd imagine. It failed, and it failed spectacularly. When the levee broke, the pressure released all at once. What came rushing down the slope towards Dronka village and the 20,000 people sheltering there wasn't just floodwater. It was a chemical fire riding on the torrent of a flash flood, a vast wall of burning fuel and floodwater which was aimed directly at the village below. One report called it a watery inferno, another described it as a river of boiling oil. Neither of these accounts was an exaggeration. The houses in Dronka were mostly mud brick, with very little in the way of elevation, so there were no upper floors to flee to. There was no way to climb up above the fire. The raging, burning torrent flooded the northern part of the village, and people trapped in their homes had nowhere to go. There was no path of escape. The streets were on fire. Liquid fire flooded in through open doorways and smashed through windows. Cars out in the streets exploded. You couldn't outrun this flood of burning fuel as there was simply nowhere to go. For the men, women and children of Dronka, that afternoon you were either drowned, suffocated by smoke, or burned alive. Or all three at once. Those were your choices. One survivor described it as being like a massive napalm attack. Ahmed Mohammed, a local butcher, lost 11 members of his family as the burning water surged through the narrow lanes of Dronka. He watched as they were just swept away, screaming as they burned in the churning floodwater. Eventually, the Egyptian rescue services arrived, but by the time they got there, that section of the village had already been gutted. More than 200 homes had been destroyed, and hundreds of people were missing. One of the fuel tanks was still burning, and it continued to burn right through the night, lighting up the night sky whilst responders picked their way through the wreckage. As dawn broke over Dronka, the storm clouds began to lift, revealing a sickening sight. What lay there now barely resembled a village. Streets were choked with mud and soot, charred walls leaned precariously inwards or had collapsed altogether. The air was thick with the acrid stench of burned fuel, and bodies were scattered throughout the ruins. Some were half submerged in oily water, others lay sprawled in doorways or crumpled behind their houses. In places, entire families had died together, caught where the fire and flood had overtaken them. At first, nobody knew how many people had died. Early news reports gave a figure of around 150, but this was quickly revised upwards and reports began to talk about 500 to 600 fatalities. The figure eventually adopted by the World Meteorological Organization and repeated later by Guinness World Records was 469. So at least 469 men, women and children either burned or drowned, and hundreds more were wounded. An entire section of the village was left completely uninhabitable, and in the following days around 20,000 people just got up and left, walking to the nearby city of Aswit. This wasn't an organised evacuation, it was just a spontaneous mass exodus. People just upped and left, carrying whatever possessions they had, or carrying wounded family members to try and get medical aid. What little there was in the way of an inquiry confirmed the obvious. A basic containment system like a trench or levee could have redirected the flood away from Dronka. But there was no indication that any safety feature had ever even been considered. No one was prosecuted and no public inquiry was held. This was military property, protected from scrutiny, and it was immune to civilian accountability. One unnamed government official was simply quoted as saying, "Mother Nature, sometimes she can be very cruel," parroting the line that tried to deflect responsibility for this onto the stormy weather. But as far as I know, Mother Nature didn't decide to put a bunch of highly flammable fuel tanks directly above a residential village. Drunka wasn't wiped off the map, it's still there, but many people never returned to the burned out shells of what had once been their homes. And today, Drunka's name mainly shows up in the weather databases or safety engineering reports as it holds the distinction of being the deadliest lightning-triggered disaster on record. If you look at the satellite images, it seems that the fuel depot is also still there. The tanks look to be still on the same slope, spaced out in the same way. There seems to be no wall, no trench or runoff channel either. So for the sake of the residents of Dronka today, let's just hope that that old saying about lightning never striking twice holds true for them.